I think it's really important if you've not got a whole lot of experience to make sure that you can mentor up with somebody that does. Because it seems to me that's what I missed when I first started. I had no kind of reference for doing anything, and you know, it was like
your own experience.
Yes,
being
and
supervised by your PhD.
yes, and if I reflect on my own, you know, experience, it wasn't particularly great. You know, so and that's often the sort of situation that we're in, that we find that it's, shall we say, we're repeating the same problems that we had, you know, that had experienced ourselves, a little bit like bad parenting, you know. So it's, you know, and you don't want to do that, you know, you don't want to do that. So, yeah, figuring out your contribution to a thesis, and remember, it's the student's thesis, you know, it's their work. That's what we kind of forget sometimes, that I see the world in a particular way. I see it all through the lens of the theory that I use, right? So I'm wanting to see more of that, right? Okay, but that's not necessarily what should happen. So knowing when to back off. And I've had this situation with an accounting student recently. So I saw that they were using multiple methods. I saw that one of the methods was theoretically incompatible with the other, and you know, and I thought, you know, you should use mine. You know, that's a lot better. You know, and so you have to be. This is why you have to communicate within the team as well. You need to get that coherent view. There's no point in you sort of pushing your particular line, particularly.
I don't think it's appropriate to push.
Yeah. So there's some learnings that you get from the supervision which are not about research. They're about how to do the supervision. And so you're getting some different levels of benefit from the supervision. And so you should, I think, particularly early on, allow yourself to just, okay, well, I'm not going to get my way. I'm not going to get my way. I'm not going to get, you know, that particular job, but it gives me some ideas. Maybe I can use my theory in another direction. There's also a power dynamic in supervision as well. So, you know, we have to be aware of that. As an early career researcher, you are not going to necessarily get your way. Particularly if you've got a professor who's saying, "Oh no, it's got to be done. It's got to be done the way I do it." Right. So these are all interesting aspects. Congratulations for taking on a student that's outside your discipline area. So multidisciplinary supervision of that nature, you are probably learning quite a lot. Certainly about the domain that's the thesis is about. It's actually a really good thing to try. It's a good thing to try because you want to actually see how your discipline relates to some completely different domain you've not been trained in. So most of my supervisions are like this. So my background is information systems and I guess what you might call computing related things. But when I came back to the university after some years in the UK, I was doing lots of computing related stuff, which was a little bit outside of my area. And then I ended up supervising marketing students, which was a bit of a stretch, I can tell you, you know, because you have to sort of hold back that impulse of, you know, what am I doing this for, you know? I did have this feeling. And then after a while, I sort of saw the sense of it. I went, oh, okay, that's a bit interesting, you know? So over time, you end up with a portfolio. So my portfolio includes engineering, computing science, software engineering, not buildings and things, information systems, management, operations, marketing. So it's you know, I'm actually really proud of that. That sort of it's one thing to be an excellent supervisor in the domain you know and be useless outside of, you know, like a power band, you're only useful at one thing, or more generally a knowledge of supervision, which is what you may be learning more about, even if you're not necessarily aware of it. It's about how you deal with others and how you deal with differences and how you map your disciplinary knowledge into another domain. Okay, how to be extremely picky, right? Firstly, find yourself a good first supervisor as a mentor, someone you like, right? Someone that you feel you can communicate with. I think that's the most important thing first up, particularly when you're starting, right? So find somebody that you think you can learn from, right? The second thing is, don't go on to some legacy system. Really don't, some legacy supervision. Don't do that. Get some experience in a normal supervision. The other thing is that dissolving as much as is possible, as much as is useful, distinctions between supervisor and student so that we create a team. We try and create a team. So this is a team effort now. And what we're trying to do is to figure out first very specific tasks, a so-called product backlog that is all of the tasks that are needed for this PhD, even if we don't know how to do them. Try and figure out as many of the tasks as possible that constitute the PhD. And then at a particular stage when we decide we're working on, say, methodology chapter, then we try and pick as many tasks as makes sense for that. Those tasks should be as small as possible. So if we're talking about, say, a particular method, how do we actually set up the experiment? How do we know when the method's applied correctly to a piece of data, for example? And the student should write that up. And then the student should test that. And the student should figure out where that bit goes in that chapter. You see? Very small tasks. What you don't want to have is a task that ends up being an epic. That is, do the methodology chapter, right? Which is something that will blow the timeline out. So, reflect on your own experiences as a HDR candidate. Were there great swaths of your candidature where you could reflect on it now and say, yep, that was time wasted? Yeah. I think but it's important to actually say, how that came about, to figure out how that came about in your own candidature. And when you're supervising others, to ensure that you're not yourself doing that to your students. You probably wouldn't have heard some of these kinds of stories or issues because most supervisions proceed well, but always any supervision there is some feeling of unease about it. And I think those are the ones to reflect on the most. Those are the ones that will teach you the most about supervision. So we've talked about removing a waterfall approach to supervision, applying an agile approach, one methodology for which is Scrum, and a particular technique within Scrum that's very useful is the sprint, and we organise aspects of the supervision. I've never done a complete supervision as a series of sprints, but I don't see any reason why you couldn't do it. Be a bit exhausting. But you'd probably get it done in 18 months. That's the other advantage. It would be a quick supervision because you'd be through it at the end, but you'd probably all be a mess at the end of it. But certainly in time-critical periods, and certainly at periods where you need to discover things, this kind of approach is a good one to use. It's one of the toolkits you should have in your arsenal as a supervisor to use an alternative way of basically project managing the project. This is why I'm always I've characterised the institution's perspective on supervision as a sort of bureaucratic approach. But I believe as a supervisor, you need to understand all of those rules and regulations in relation to that. But the student also needs to understand them. This is typically why in the training that you would get from the graduate research school, there would be a section that says the first supervision meeting is very important because there you describe to the student what their hierarchy is, just as we do in subject outlines, where there's a lecturer and then there's a coordinator of the course, and if you've got issues, you need to go through a particular path. And so I would see that would be a failure of that policy, basically, that you were not informed about what to do when issues occurred. And it's also a failure of the institution to not be monitoring you. So that coordinator, I can lay the blame directly on the coordinator of that honours program, because they should be monitoring the progress of students.
Yeah.
That's a bit harsh, but I would say that's the institution's responsibility. They should have been doing that, irrespective of the implosion that was going on. Having said that, there's only a few mandated times where you get to sniff that out if there's an issue. So one of them for PhDs is the research proposal review at the end of the first year. Then you can see when there's issues, but that's already a third into the candidature for a full-time student, or a sixth if they're part-time. Well, you don't get them halfway through that first year for them, so it's going to be the same. It's a third of the way through. The other thing is that often there's so much waste in the supervisory process itself that if you've got a bright student for honours, the honours can actually be done quickly if they can write. And I've had direct experience of that, where I saw a student write a first-class honours and a medal-winning one in 3 weeks. Well, they shouldn't have had to gone through that either, as you shouldn't have had to have gone through that. I'm not a great believer in, allowing the student to sort of like be shoved into the ether, because it reminds me very much of my own candidature. I expect supervisors to have some input into that and help shape that to an extent. Knowing that, it's an interesting point you raise at a meta level, is how much engagement with a student's project should you have as a supervisor? How much assistance should you give, and when is that not right? When is it okay? That's a hard thing, and so it's a hard thing to know where that boundary should be. And I know it shifts as you progress through the supervision, so it's, every circumstance is unique, which is why I advocate you reflecting on your own experiences, both as a student and also as a supervisor, because the institution can't possibly direct you in that regard. They've got their milestones. That gets them out of legal issues primarily. And then how do you engage with students? And I'm grateful you mentioned this as a question, because if it's in your mind as a question, it's possibly something that affects how you supervise. Yeah. Just because they were lucky enough to have good students, a good student in you, doesn't mean they were good supervisors. So I was a good student. I was a great student, I really was. And I was no trouble, All I required was, when I put a draft in front of, a chapter in front of my supervisor, that they edited it. And as a mathematician, my supervisor had a very logical mind, and so when I missed things out, he was, very forthcoming in his criticism, and he would write it all out. And so I learnt as a student, because I was kind of intrigued by this whole process of research as well. I judged the amount of red ink as an indicator of whether I was doing well or not. So my first drafts were just like, my writing was in blue, or my typing was in black, but his ink was in red. He was an ex-teacher, so it was like really, you felt like you were being graded in high school, right? And as the drafts got better and better, the ink went down, and I knew it was ready when there was no ink. No ink on that page. I didn't care whether he liked the topic or not. I didn't care whether he thought semiotics was a bad idea or not. But if he couldn't write a comment on it, I knew I'd got him. That was my whole. But isn't that sort of like a completely upside down approach to the supervision process? It only worked because I had enough strength to continue that, because otherwise it would have been crushing for somebody that had less ego perhaps than me. But also, you know, what a sad loss of a relationship, because I find supervision incredible. You know, these people are often extending my research. I want to treat them with a lot of respect, you know, and I think, you know, that is how you should conduct yourself as a supervisor, until it's proved otherwise, you know. I think what you did is exhibits one of the core characteristics of a good supervisor, is to consciously reflect on your own experience and make sure it doesn't happen if it's negative with your students. Yeah, but the size of them are going to depend on, I couldn't feel comfortable in writing a task in an area I didn't know. You'd have to be the final arbiter of that. And it would also depend on where the student's at. So a student that, one of my students is suffering from mental health problems, the task size has to be doable within basically about an hour. So I think about how long will it take her to do it, because I know after about an hour of concentrated work she's exhausted. So how many of those can I push through her in a 2-week period? So you need to use your own experience, your own familiarity with the domain to select the task size. But I think a unit of effort, like how long would it take the student to do this in an hour, you notice that changes. The more experience the student gets and the further along the project, hopefully, the more they can do in an hour. So the larger the task can be a little bit. But I'd be trying to not stretch the tasks in more difficulty as you go. It's good to have a rhythm. You don't want to disrupt that by them hitting a task that they can't do, because that derails them and it adds waste. You have to throw that task back into the product backlog and reconsider it, and you've derailed the student. So I'd like to see that with your whole Scrum effort, you've got roughly a unit, maybe an hour or two. Depends on the student. You know, I've got students who would challenge me to give them stuff to do, so it's like, oh gosh, you know, what can I throw at them? You know, they'll get it done in 2 hours, I know, because they're brilliant, you know. So I've had that situation where it's almost the opposite of, you know, giving them a really difficult problem to do, because I know they'll do it, and if they do it, they've gotten a major part of their thesis done. So I've had that situation as well. Yeah. So unfortunately, it's how long is a piece of string? It's one of those answers, yeah? I don't think that you will find really any kind of HDR supervisory code of practice when you have a mental health issue in the team, or if you have a student who is suffering from mental health. Without training to recognise the signs, and I can only really work from my own experience here, I'm not claiming anything else. From my experience, there are signs typically before there's an issue, but nobody gets taught how to recognise them. 2 of them that I've noticed myself are this imposter syndrome, because I can hear it in the discussions that are going on, and sometimes I have seen this procrastination as also an indicator, particularly when there's an unwillingness on the part of a student to meet up with their team over a protracted period of time. So this would be red flags. I am not suggesting that we become psychologists and do something about that. I'm just suggesting that it makes sense from an institutional point of view, from a professional development point of view, to recognise signs. So part of this kind of session is to exchange experiences, and experience of these particular issues are the things that are important to exchange. That's one of the things that should be exchanged, I think. The idea is that you should try and codify your experience into one of 3 kinds of stories. One is a recount. What happened? Immediately. This happened, and that happened, and that happened, and that happened. That's one way of sharing experience. Another way of sharing experience is to give examples, an exemplum. It's got certain stages as well. And finally, reflect on an exceptional incident or reaction. That's a particular structure called an anecdote, right? So they have certain kinds of structure. Perhaps the purpose of today, and that is to continue the dialogue of sharing stories. So one thing I want to say is that I learnt about supervision by doing it and reflecting on it. But the reflection wasn't enough. I think I needed to arrange that reflection into a story so I could remember it and hopefully give you experiences so that you can benefit from them or not. So yeah, you often, particularly early on, you often don't have the opportunity of grabbing one yourself. Although you may be contacted by one of your former students, that's sometimes how it works. Well, you may know them because you've been an honours supervisor for them as well. But if they're an undergraduate student in business, you'd probably want them to do a master's by research first. Often, if you've got really good students, they haven't done an honours, they want to do postgrad, you might enrol them in a master's, research master's for a year, and then they have the opportunity to transition into a PhD. So that's one possibility. You should be confident in your area of expertise, and you should, I think, be competent to communicate with a student. If you are not able to address students, challenge them in a way that's sensible, if you don't have the communicative chops when it comes to engaging with a student, best to see that in action with more experienced people and you get a flavour of how that should work. I felt I had reflected a lot on my own experience as a HDR candidate, and I absolutely knew how I didn't want to run a supervision. And I didn't want to run a supervision like I'd been supervised, to be frank. I wanted the student to be comfortable around me. I didn't want them to be my friend. But I wanted them to know that I was on their side. See the difference? Sometimes the friendship emerges. You can't help it, you know. Like my colleague across the corridor, you know, we're mates. I know his wife, I know his kid, you know. I was at his wedding, you know. It's just, sometimes that happens, but don't look for it because you mostly don't get it, and also it can be a problem. It can be misconstrued. So I would say, if you can get people to trust you, you can develop that trust, you might be ready to take it on, as long as you've had experience of it before. So recently, there used to be a requirement that to take on a first supervision, you should have completed 2. You've been involved in the completion of 2. Now I think that's changed to 1. I'd still think it's probably a good idea to not be a first supervisor unless you've had more than 1 experience. You can't use your own experience as a PhD candidate unless you're very committed to supervision, because you can make mistakes. I think it's good to have a couple, and then I'd feel a bit more confident. The institution would feel very confident in you. Depends on the role that you're taking on. So it's possible to be a first supervisor, a principal supervisor, without knowing very much about the domain at all, because you're managing the supervision and the team. The more you can contribute to the supervision in terms of methodology, theory, literature, insights, the better off you are. So strangely enough, I would feel confident taking on almost any, almost any non-quantitative supervision, because I'm experienced in mixed methods and qualitative research, and I myself am a multidisciplinary researcher, so I've done stuff like shark management policy studies, and I've done, systems design, I've done all sorts of areas. Interestingly, I feel to be a good principal supervisor, having a breadth of knowledge helps, and also having people that have domain expertise and knowing when they should enter and have a real involvement is also another one of those crafts you have to learn. I mean, you just have to do this stuff to get good at it, I think. The wrong time to do that is after the paper is written by the student. That's completely the wrong time to do it. So those issues about IP, involvement, attribution, well, firstly, there's a policy about it, there's a code of practice about it, so get familiar with that. I run by the principle of no attribution without contribution. Now, I can do that because I'm a professor now. I can just insist on that. I've had situations where other co-supervisors have been professors and that their expectation would be that they'd be on everything regardless of what they wrote. I think that's against the spirit of the University of Wollongong's code of practice. So there must be some engagement with that material. That could be in many different areas. It could be securing money, it could be in getting access to facilities, it could be editing, it could be a lot of things that are necessary to get a paper up and running. But every time, firstly, the papers should be planned, they should be about the PhD, the student should be the first author, right? And the supervisors nut out a sequence. So with a student who happens to be my colleague in the corridor, was a former student, how that worked was he became first author. I typically had more involvement than the second supervisor, theoretically and methodologically, and the second supervisor was an active supervisor, so they were the third author. Now that he's an academic and not a student, the three of us still work together and we negotiate who goes first, and it's based on who's initiated and propelled the paper. Typically, it's the former student, and I think my former co-supervisor and me, we just basically say, oh, who was the last? Number two. Okay, all right, it was me. Okay, you go number two now. Thank you for turning up and being engaged. I've gotten some things out of this myself. I hope you've got something out of it. Always best to talk about real stuff. I have stories I could tell you that will curl your hair. I've got stories of incredible success that would make you feel, really happy if you had them. I think there's nothing more valuable than this kind of teaching because it leads to research outcomes. It's a plus, I think. Thanks for your time.